Welcome to the deep dive. We take a stack of sources, articles, research, our own notes, and we pull out the key bits, the really important nuggets. Basically a shortcut so you're well informed. Today, we're getting into something everyone knows about, but it often makes us a bit uncomfortable. Lying. Why do we even do it? How does it actually affect us and the people around us? And is it really possible to, spot it?
It's such a complex area, and you're absolutely right. It's almost woven into the very fabric of how humans communicate. What's really interesting about the sources we looked at is how they push us past just judging. They show that not all lies are malicious. There's a whole spectrum. There are a range of intentions. So our mission today is really to understand the why behind deception and what it means for our relationships and even for ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're going to try and unpack all these complexities, like how the brain reacts physiologically, which is pretty surprising stuff, and those subtle behavioral cues we might pick up on. And even, this is counterintuitive, why we sometimes want to believe things that aren't true. It's such a fundamental part of being human, isn't it? Something we all deal with. Okay, so our sources suggest something pretty bold. Everyone lies. How do they even start to break that down? Such a universal thing.
Yeah, that phrase, everyone lies, it definitely grabs your attention, doesn't it? So the sources, drawing on psychological research, they tend to categorize lies into four main types. First up, you've got self-serving lies. These are basically told to dodge punishment or maybe gain some kind of personal advantage. Then there are the other-serving lies. These are often what we call white lies. Yeah, told to protect someone else's feelings or just to kind of smooth over social interactions.
Like telling a friend that their, let's say, interesting new haircut looks fantastic.
Exactly like that. Precisely. Then, moving on, we get habitual lies. Now, these are deceptions that are repeated so often they become almost second nature, like automatic. And finally, there are the high-stakes lies. And as the name suggests, these ones carry pretty serious consequences. Think fraud or, betrayal.
Okay, so we have these categories, but what about the deeper reasons? Beyond just the type of lie, what do the sources say really motivates people to deceive?
That's really where it gets insightful. Sometimes it boils down to fear. The fear of rejection can be just overwhelming. Other times it's about control, right? Gaining or keeping a sense of control over a situation or maybe another person. And often, as one source really points out, it's simply because lying can feel easier in the moment than facing up to an uncomfortable truth. But here's the kicker. When you look at the overall effect, no matter the reason, every lie, doesn't matter which category, it chips away at trust. It subtly changes that landscape of honesty. And that raises a pretty important question about the long-term impact, on relationships, sure, but also on how we see ourselves.
That erosion of trust, that's a really powerful point. But you mentioned earlier there's this internal side too. What's actually going on inside our heads when we decide to lie? Does the brain react in a specific way?
Oh, it absolutely does. Yeah, the research gives us some fascinating glimpses into the brain's response. When someone lies, you see increased activity in particular areas. The prefrontal cortex, for one, that's our executive control center, right? Involved in decision-making, impulse control. The amygdala, too, which is our emotional hub, that lights up, signaling there's an emotional component. And significantly, the anterior cingulate cortex. This part basically flags conflict. When something feels off or contradictory, its activity ramps up.
Okay, so the first lie triggers this sort of stress response, this conflict signal in the brain. What happens then if someone keeps lying? Does the brain just keep reacting like that?
No, not at all. And this is where it gets really compelling, I think. The research shows that if the lying continues, the brain actually starts to desensitize that initial stress, that kind of internal alarm bell. It gets quieter. It's an adaptation. It makes each subsequent lie feel easier, more automatic. It's almost like how any other habit forms, neurologically speaking.
Wow.
And this isn't just about, little white lies. It's a neurological pathway that can potentially erode your own sense of integrity bit by bit. It's a pretty stark reminder, actually, that even small lies can set a precedent, not just for how others see you, but for how your own brain processes truth.
That's a bit chilling.
Yeah.
The idea that the brain just gets used to it, or maybe stops even noticing the discomfort. So if our brains are doing that, what about our ability to spot lies in other people? Pop culture loves the idea of definitive tells, but our sources seem to say something else entirely.
That's a really crucial distinction to make. Yeah, contrary to what you see in movies, there's no single foolproof tell, nothing that definitively proves someone is lying. There's no magic gesture, no specific facial twitch that just screams liar. However, there are subtle cues, things that research suggests might indicate dishonesty, but we have to see them as clues, right? Not proof. They should prompt curiosity and maybe a closer look, but definitely not instant judgment.
Okay, so what kind of subtle cues are we talking about then? What does the research point to?
Well, the sources highlight a few indicators that tend to crop up. One is too much detail. A person might over-explain, adding lots of unnecessary facts to sound more believable. Another is an inconsistent story. The facts or the timeline changes when they retell it. Then there's the classic avoiding eye contact. But interestingly, also too much eye contact. Sometimes people overcompensate.
Okay, trying too hard.
Exactly. You might also notice more speech hesitations, more maybe some nervous laughter that doesn't quite fit. And finally, something called microexpressions. These are really fleeting, involuntary, emotional reactions that flash across the face, but they don't match the words being said.
So it sounds less like a checklist and more about noticing maybe a cluster of these things and always considering the context, not just jumping to conclusions based on one.
Precisely. Context is absolutely key. And it's about deviation from someone's baseline behavior, too. Are they suddenly doing these things when they normally don't? Even for experts, it's rarely about certainty in one go. It's about patterns, observation, and using these cues to guide further inquiry, not to condemn immediately.
Okay, and then there's this other layer, maybe even deeper. Our sources suggest that sometimes we actually want to believe lies, which feels really counterintuitive. Why would we fall for deception, even if maybe some of these cues are there?
Yeah, this is one of the most, I think, insightful parts of the material we looked at. We often fall for lies because the lie itself, even though it's false, serves a purpose for us. It might protect our hope, or spare us from pain, or maybe it just keeps a relationship going, even if that relationship isn't built on solid ground. Sometimes the truth is just, well, it's too difficult or uncomfortable to accept right then.
Wow. That's really powerful. It means we're not just being deceived by others. We're actually, in a way, participating. We deceive ourselves, maybe without even realizing it sometimes. And maybe that self-deception is the hardest truth to face. It just makes the whole thing incredibly messy and, well, incredibly human.
It really does. It highlights that tension, doesn't it, between our desire for comfort and our search for truth. Sometimes they're just in conflict.
So, wrapping this up then, our deep dive today shows that lying is, well, it's messy, it's complicated, it's definitely emotional, and it's part of being human. We do it for all sorts of reasons, protection, survival, sometimes just to be liked. But the sources are really clear on this. The truth, whenever it finally comes out, it always lands with more weight, more consequence than the lie ever did.
That's very well put. And if you connect that to the bigger picture, truth isn't just about facts. Fundamentally, it's about a feeling of safety. And the wisdom that comes out of our sources here is both simple and, I think, quite profound. If you really want to get better at spotting lies in other people, the suggestion is start by being radically honest with yourself. And if you genuinely value truth, the advice is to work on creating an environment in your own life where honesty actually feels safe, where it's not punished. So maybe the thought to leave you with is this. What does this all mean for how you can cultivate those environments? Places where honesty can actually thrive, not just for others, but importantly for yourself too.